Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The election is now just 25 days away, and Donald Trump is very clearly planning to run the same playbook from last time. We are watching a slow-motion insurrection. In these final weeks of the campaign, Trump and his allies are laying all the groundwork, getting ready to reject the free and fair result of this election if he does not win. That's plain as day. We all know it, right? Today, J.D. Vance said he would help his running mate in another coup attempt after refusing to acknowledge that Trump actually lost in 2020 over and over again.
Do you believe he lost the 2020 election?
I think that Donald Trump and I have both raised a number of issues with the 2020 election, but we're focused on the future. I think there's an obsession here with focusing on 2020. I'm much more worried about what happened after 2020, which is a wide open border, groceries that are unaffordable. And look,
Senator, yes or no?
Okay.
Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Let me ask you a question. Is it okay that big technology companies censored the Hunter Biden laptop story, which independent analysis have said it cost Donald Trump millions of votes?
Senator Vance, I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Did big technology companies censor a story that independent studies have suggested would have cost Trump millions of votes?
Senator
I think that's
Vance,
the question.
I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
And I've answered your question with another question. You answer my question and I'll answer yours.
Senator, would you have certified the election in 2020? Yes or no?
I've said that I would have voted against certification because of the concern that I just raised. I think that when you have technology companies...
The answer is no.
Now, to some degree, perpetuating the 2020 lie is about protecting Donald Trump's fragile ego. And J.D. Vance, as his eager crony, right, has to make sure, like, the big guy doesn't get upset. But also, more seriously, we have to take J.D. Vance and Trump seriously. Every day, they're telling us how they're approaching this, right? They're openly plotting to steal this election. Because while we may be used to the lies and the anti-democratic rhetoric after so many years, and in some ways we just are heading towards a very dangerous and precarious moment. And I know I'm not saying anything new or earth-shattering or like wildly insightful by saying that, but it must be said. 25 days out. So next month, we're going to find out, election night, night after, week after, who won, right? If Kamala Harris has won 270 electoral votes. Now, that will not actually be enough for her to be sworn in as the next president. And here's the rub. In years past, it was. In 2004 and 2012, other elections I've covered in 2016. But what is going to happen is that our democratic system will be existentially challenged once again as Donald Trump attempts to do what he did in 2020. Everybody knows this. This time, he will have a much bigger running start, as well as the backing of the Republican Party, a whole group of right-wing lawyers, and possibly, as we saw on January 6th, violent mobs. It's just the reality. It's not a question if it's going to happen. Like, if Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are going to come out and be like, well, we conceded defeat, we called Kamala Harris. No. Again, Trump and his running mate have told us over and over again they will not accept defeat. The people who work closely with him agree. General Mark Milley, this is Trump's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is a pretty serious dude. His top general worked with Trump, was in the room with him, says Trump is, quote, a fascist to the core. Not my assessment. A fascist to the core and the most dangerous person in the country. That's who we're dealing with. And Trump's allies are already taking action. Republicans are attempting to seed the ground for a legal battle, filing election-related lawsuits all over the country. According to Democracy Docket, a voting rights news platform that tracks election litigation, the Republican Party has been involved in 97 lawsuits so far this election cycle. That's more than 3 times the number we saw ahead of the 2020 election, which, again, was in the midst of COVID, where there was a lot more actually happening on the ground, like states having to change stuff around. The New York Times notes the lawsuits are concentrated in swing states and key counties likely to determine the race. Several of the suits embrace debunk theories about voter fraud and so-called stolen elections that Trump has promoted since 2020. In the 3rd largest county in Pennsylvania, the state that may be the tipping point in the election, the Republican Party is seeking to force local officials to count ballots by hand, evoking debunked conspiracy theories about corrupted voting machines. In the swing state of Nevada, the Republican National Committee falsely claims in a new suit that nearly 4,000 non-citizens voted in 2020. That's obviously nonsense. This week, the RNC filed a lawsuit in Michigan challenging the ability of certain voters who live overseas but are U.S. citizens to cast a ballot in the battleground state. Now, the only answer to this attempt to undo the republic, to finish what they started on January 6th, is to work like hell to preserve democracy through democratic means. Democrats in the Harris campaign have to run hard. They have to persuade people. They have to use rhetoric and logic and reason, right? And emotion to win more votes in swing states. And they've got to fight back in the courts. And as we saw last time, it may come down to having enough people with integrity who are Republicans nominally in key positions at key moments. And none of this is ideal or even really fair, but it's the reality of the situation. It's weird not to call it out all the time. Like we're just having, oh, so-and-so's running an ad. They're doing these campaign events. They're having, Even though we all lived through Donald Trump's first attempt at coup, the one he was never held for account for, there is something surreal about watching it happen again right now in front of our faces. Ian Bassin is co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. Fernita Tolson is an election law expert and professor at the University of Southern California School of Law. She's co-host of the Free and Fair podcast, and they join me now. Professor, let me start with you on the election landscape. One of the things that's interesting with these lawsuits, the one that I mentioned, for instance, in Nevada, saying that 4,000 non-citizens have voted. Like, that's nonsense, obviously. The suit has nowhere to go. But some folks make the argument, and I think the folks at Democracy Docket have said that there's zombie lawsuits, that basically they exist to wrap a talking point in a legal filing so that after the election, if they lose Nevada, they can say, we've got thousands of non-citizen voters. Look, we filed a suit beforehand, that it's essentially a kind of big lie seeding through legal means. What do you think of that theory?
So first, Chris, thank you for having me on the show. Yeah, that is it's incredibly plausible that these lawsuits are being brought in order to lay the groundwork for challenges post-election. But let's take a step back. I think that we have to look at the pre-Trump years, which really validated this notion that fraud exists, right? So in 2008, when the U.S. Supreme Court allowed states to pass laws to address fraud, even if they didn't have any evidence that fraud existed, well, that was our introduction to this idea that, well, fraud might exist. We just don't know if it exists or not. So we're just going to assume it exists. And so in some ways, Trump did not introduce this. 2020 did not introduce this. This has been almost 15 years of a slow move towards legitimizing fraud in our system, even though we don't have any proof of widespread fraud. So one of the reasons I want to make this point is because I don't want people to assume that even if Kamala Harris wins next month, that this goes away, right? This has been building before Trump, and it will exist after Trump, and it will be used to further more voting restrictions, even if we get past this election cycle.
Ian, let me play for you what the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said was a similar answer to J.D. Vance. And I want to get your sense of the import of this. Again, at one level, it's about Trump's ego, but it seems deeper to me, particularly when you're talking about people that will be in key roles. This is Mike Johnson being asked by George Stephanopoulos the same question about the outcome of the 2020 election.
Can you say unequivocally that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and Donald Trump lost?
See, this is the game that is always played by mainstream media with leading Republicans. It's a gotcha game.
Now, Johnson followed that up by saying his worries about the 2024 election, the professor's point that thousands upon thousands of non-citizens will be voting. This seems like the line they are hitting ahead of the time so they could use it to overturn the results.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a strategy here of the 3 Ds: deceive, disrupt, and deny. The plan is to deceive people before the election with all of these false narratives and scurrilous accusations that don't have any grounding in reality. And then when election time comes around, election day, and now we're in early voting, disrupt with aggressive poll monitoring, with frivolous lawsuits, with what they did in 2022, with people trying to interfere with drop boxes, and then to deny. Right, as you noted, after the election, to be able to say, see, there was all this evidence of problems, and therefore we're going to deny the result if we lose. The term you referenced earlier, zombie lawsuits, that my colleague Ben Berwick coined about these lawsuits that are seeds, as you said, planted today, that could give them the opportunity after the election to deny the results. And I think the thing you're pointing out now about J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson is that unlike in 2020, Trump now has stocked people around him and created a Republican Party that is fully on board. He still had 147 votes in the Republican Party last time. He has even more this time because he's gotten rid of anybody who would stand in his way. And I think this poses the very danger that General Milley alluded to. And I want to point out, Chris, something that you just flagged on the screen. General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Trump, called him a fascist to the core. And you put up on the screen a news article reporting it from The Independent, a newspaper out of England. The other newspaper that has covered it so far is The Guardian out of England. Where is the American press putting this on banner headlines tomorrow? I mean, it's as if a doctor called your house to tell you you had a fatal heart condition and needed emergency surgery, and the person taking the message wrote it on a Post-it and buried it in some paperwork under the phone. No, if you get that message, you find the person who needs the surgery, you grab them by the collar, and you slap the Post-it on their forehead. And that's what the media needs to do for the days and weeks ahead to warn the American people.
But back to politics. Former President Barack Obama campaigned for Vice President Kamala Harris for the first time last night. The former president headlined a rally in Pittsburgh where he criticized and relentlessly mocked Donald Trump.
There is absolutely no evidence that this man thinks about anybody but himself. I've said it before. Donald Trump is a 78-year-old billionaire who has not stopped whining about his problems since he rode down his golden escalator 9 years ago. You've got the tweets in all caps, the ranting and the raving about crazy conspiracy theories. You got the 2-hour speeches, word salad. Just, you know, it's like Fidel Castro. Just on and on. Constant attempts to sell you stuff. Who does that? Selling you gold sneakers and a $100,000 watch and most recently a Trump Bible. You know, he wants you to buy the Word of God, Donald Trump edition. Got his name right there next to Matthew and Luke. Reason some people think, well, I don't know, I remember that economy when he first came in being pretty good. Yeah, it was pretty good, because it was my economy. We had 75 straight months of job growth that I handed over to him. It wasn't something he did. I had spent 8 years cleaning up the mess that the Republicans had left me the last time. So just in case everybody has a hazy memory, he didn't do nothing except those big tax cuts. As I recall, Donald Trump was president for 4 years. And if rounding up and deporting millions of desperate people and building the beautiful wall, and didn't matter whether some of those folks you rounded up were women and children, if that's the answer to everything, well, why didn't you solve the problem? Why were the number of immigrants basically the same when you left office as when you took office? I'll tell you why. Because he didn't have a real plan. He had talking points. He had concepts of a plan. And the plan was mean and ugly.
So, Gene Robinson, that's Barack Obama last night in Pittsburgh, state they have to win the Harris campaign. And people wondering how and when will they use the former president, Obama. And that's exactly where you want to use him in the state of Pennsylvania. If the Harris campaign, that's how you want to use him, which is kind of free form, mocking Donald Trump, which he's done a lot. He did it, remember, in his convention speech back in Chicago, talking about those terrible sneakers, the Trump Bible, which, by the way, we learned this week is made in China, but we can talk about that later. How effective is Barack Obama, and how much do you expect to see the Harris campaign use him here in these last couple of weeks?
Well, the man can talk, right? I mean, he gives a great speech, and that was really it was entertaining, it was informative, and I think for Democrats in Pennsylvania, which is ground zero right now, it was inspiring. I mean, they need to get Democrats out to the polls, and who better to do that than Barack Obama? And I just cracked up when he, that was my economy, that line. But sort of reminding people of recent history and how little Donald Trump actually accomplished as president is just a useful thing to do. And Obama, you see why he is unanimous first ballot Hall of Fame of politics for all time, right? Because you just see what a massive political talent he is.
Yeah, and at the same time, I believe it was 2016, he was doing this, and the strategy of the campaign ended up having a bad outcome. But there's no question, Simone, that former President Barack Obama is able to deliver a message about Trump that doesn't appear to be breaking through in any other way, like actually saying, truthfully, he is lying about this, he is lying to you about this, he is lying about legal migrants, Haitian migrants in Springfield. Sometimes it's frustrating. That'll be an understatement to see that not break through with especially Republicans or just decent human beings who should be able to see the difference between right and wrong. Barack Obama, with joy and with humor, is able to sort of get through to an audience that it's not okay to lie. It's not okay to sell the presidency. It's not okay to be a narcissist and to have the reins of the presidency, and on and on and on. Where, in what swing states, in what counties do you think this message has the potential for really breaking through? Where should he go?
Well, look, I think it is indicative of where he was just last night. And let me back up and say that there was to your point about how there are good Republicans and whatnot, and yes,
decent people.
Very decent people. Like, I don't know how we got to this point that Donald Trump has people believing that just because they don't agree with you ideologically that they are the opposition. Former President Obama, in that speech last night, he has like a 4-minute riff where he's like, I'm not doing this for applause. Like, when did this become okay?
Right.
I tweeted it out last night, and that is he's having a conversation not with Democrats there, right, but with moderate Republicans, independent voters, of which there are some. Okay, there are real independents out there in the country, especially in Arizona, and he is very popular with that demographic as well. Oftentimes, President Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama are talked about as, oh, they can rally the base, and yes, that is absolutely true. But they are also very good and still very popular and have very high numbers with some of these more moderate individuals and independent voters. I will say, I think that there's a mixture of, he has to talk to those folks, and you got to do, because it's a turnout election.
Yes,
you got to turn out the base, you got to turn out some people that aren't the base. Okay, the Kamala Coalition is a broad one. I was struck by his conversation with his off-the-record stop that was very much so on the record with black men and men talking to men. Again, I just think the frankness of which President Obama addressed many things yesterday is something the Democrats should have been doing for a while. Like, in circles will say, yeah, this was Obama's economy. How is Donald Trump just taking credit for it? But yesterday, you heard Obama say, this was mine. Yeah. I did that.
Right. So, Elise, what's the reasonable argument for Republicans who are supporting Donald Trump at this point, but there's a chance you can, I mean, it's country over party. I want to talk to you about the reasonable Republicans who are perhaps, oh, come on, Liz Cheney. She went over to the other side when she did the January 6th, which she's not. Okay, she's about as Republican as it gets.
Didn't want an insurrection.
Yeah, okay. That's fair. I think that's fair, you know. But I mean, to me, it seems you got to be kind of honest about where we are. Okay, Kamala Harris is not going to be the president of your choice. It's not going to be great from your point of view because you're not going to have all the policy agreements that you would have perhaps with a real Republican nominee. But you don't have it in Donald Trump. He's not a Republican. He was a Democrat. He's donated to Kamala Harris. And look what he has done. take a look at what he has said and take a look at what he has done and ask yourself, how do you rebuild the Republican Party beyond this person? If you can't say out loud, I can't accept this narcissist who lies and hurts people, but inside you're feeling that way, what's the argument to reasonable Republicans that you can do this? You could actually vote for Kamala Harris and actually believe that that is a path to the Republican Party ultimately rebuilding itself, having a chance to unleash itself from the chains of this cult leader.
Right-leaning voters who are considering Kamala Harris need to know that she's not a radical liberal. And I don't think that the Trump campaign has managed to paint her as a radical San Francisco liberal. And that's what they were trying to do from the onset. They haven't had much time, and they haven't really been able to do it. And I think that if you're willing to bridge the Democratic-Republican divide, you're worried about Trump's stability, and it comes down to a values argument. Do you trust this person? Is this someone, are these the kind of values that you want your children? The argument that Liz Cheney very eloquently has been stating, and it's, you know, how it goes, this is not about politics. It isn't about ideology anymore. It's about basic American values, and that is how she's going to woo those right-leaning voters.
Joining us now, Michigan State Democratic Party Chair Lavora Barnes, Democratic State Senator of Pennsylvania Marty Flynn, and Charles Coleman, former prosecutor, MSNBC legal analyst, and co-host of the MSNBC special Black Men in America, The Road to 2024. When Barack Obama, Charles, puts his arms akimbo and says, I've got a problem with that, and he's looking at you. Look, you wrote an essay about this for the New York Times. It was headlined, Black men are waiting for a Democratic Party that delivers for them. Where do you see the gap in what the campaign is offering and what black men are looking for?
Well, I think one of the things that has to be understood is that you're talking to a very specific segment of this voting demographic. You're talking to primarily black males who are under the age of 50. And when you talk about that, they are looking at the big picture in terms of everything that they are measuring their future by, and they're not necessarily seeing much that's promising. They're seeing themselves still in last place in a number of different indexes, and that's troubling to them. One of the things that I was a little bit, I have, Chris, a profound amount of respect for our 44th Commander-in-Chief, Barack Obama. However, I don't think that the rhetoric yesterday in terms of how it was framed was helpful to the conversation. There's no other voting bloc that you would talk to in that way and then turn around and expect their support. And I do understand that there's a nuanced language when men talk to men, and I'm very sensitive to that. But I also understand that if people are complaining about apathy and not being seen or heard, to dismiss their complaints as excuses is not a good thing.
So what would you have wanted to hear from him?
He talked about part of what black men were concerned about, or what he was concerned about in terms of the misogyny piece. But what about the other part? What are the part that is legitimate? Could you acknowledge that and talk about what the Harris and Walz campaign intends to do about whatever element of that you deem legitimate, because that's forward looking and that's going to get black men motivated, not downing them and telling them why, you know, they're so bad in terms of where they are now or interrogating her candidacy.
So, Lavora, there is new reporting that Democrats in your state are worried about shoring up support among black men. 36 black Detroiters told Politico their concerns include they were lamenting the campaign hasn't reached out enough to well-known grassroots organizations, that messaging targeting black men is not even being prioritized. Does that line up with what you're hearing on the ground? And if so, what do you think needs to change?
I'll start by saying what we hear on the ground, because we are on the ground and have been on the ground for years now as the Michigan Democratic Party. You know, we've got our folks in churches, in barbershops all over Detroit and all over the state, because we need to keep in mind black folks in Michigan live in other places other than Detroit. So we are making sure we're reaching out in Flint and in Pontiac and in Saginaw and Benton Harbor, everywhere black folks are. And, you know, we've reached out to churches that aren't on the top of the list. They aren't always the biggest churches. We know the campaigns go to the big churches, and so the party's been paying a lot of attention to hundreds of smaller churches where we're getting in and having conversations about how you get souls to the polls and how you put feet on the ground and how you get people to participate and vote. And we're doing the same in barber and beauty shops. We're doing the same in nightclubs. We've got folks everywhere, finding Black folks where they are to have conversations with them about this election, about Kamala Harris, about Donald Trump, and who he is and who he will be if we allow him to be president again. We're all over the place. And what we're hearing from the folks we're talking to is that they appreciate our appearance in their neighborhoods and in their towns and in their communities. And so we're going to keep doing it for the next 25 days. And frankly, because we're the state party and we're here all the time, we're going to keep doing it after this election as well.
But I guess the question is it enough to show up? And I'm not in any way dismissing that. It's important to show up. But it sounds like, from the conversations with a lot of folks, they're not hearing necessarily what they want to hear.
I think that a little bit of it is that people, we talk a lot about how we as Democrats need to fall in love. I think a lot of people are looking for that one sound bite, that one thing that they care about that they haven't yet heard from the campaign. Don't always know what that is for everyone. But we're doing, I think, a good job telling the story of who Kamala Harris and Governor Walz are and who they will be as president and vice president, and how that will impact the lives of Black men, Black women, and all the people of Michigan in a positive way. And we're going to keep doing that.
Marty, let's talk about Pennsylvania, because at his rally in your state last night, Pittsburgh, Barack Obama also called on men to reject Trump's bombast.
Yeah, I think
when Donald Trump lies or cheats or shows utter disregard for our Constitution, when he calls POWs losers or fellow citizens vermin, people make excuses for it. They think it's okay. Who seem to think Trump's behavior, the bullying and the putting people down, is a sign of strength. And I am here to tell you that is not what real strength is.
Does that resonate with Pennsylvania voters? I wonder what you're hearing on the ground about the outrage, Marty.
A lot of the time, I think it's basically a culture war that we're faced, and the way the Republican Party continues to put a war on masculinity and what they define as a strong man, and they're gonna come at us with their idea of masculinity and how they perceive the Democratic Party to approach that topic, and that's just not the truth. You know, anybody that carries himself in that way is not a strong person. Barack Obama, former president, explained that perfectly last night, that, you know, that's not a real strong man, and that's not what it's about. And you just have to look past this culture identity that they're trying to sow into our communities, that, you know, it's just hate. It's a spread of hate over and over and over again. There's no joining factors here that helps anybody.
So talk then about the ground game, because it's one thing to get a Barack Obama, one of the great orators of our time, into your community, and he can deliver. Don't worry about that. But the folks who are there on the ground, these states stay again and again, week after week, the 80-some days since Kamala Harris became the presumptive and then the nominee, in much the same place, movement a little, but within the margin of error. Tell me about the ground and what worries you about what's happening on the ground.
Democrats in my era are very, very motivated. When we switch gears from President Biden running to Kamala, there's been a real sense of energy on the ground. Everybody's motivated. There's groups all over the Northeast PA where I represent, Lackawanna, Luzerne counties, that are very, very focused, very motivated. Very focused on mail-in ballots, which is another thing where Democrats have outpaced Republicans in getting people to vote, getting out, and we're doing very well. We're doing very well. The results so far for Lackawanna County have been almost 3-1 in Democratic to Republican ballots in Lackawanna County. It's pretty much 2-1 in Luzerne County, where we're going to try and stop some of the bleeding of the Democratic votes. For the first time, Republicans have took a voter registration edge in Luzerne County this past year. So it's getting harder and harder to elect Democrats in Luzerne County. So that's something we're organizing and fighting on the ground now.
It's an interesting dichotomy, right? So Barack Obama, Lavora, comes out and, he says some tough things. And then, a lot of Republicans get upset about it. The same people who don't necessarily get upset at the things that Donald Trump says that arguably are a little more incendiary. For example, let me ask you about what I'm going to play now. Donald Trump in the city of Detroit, in front of business leaders in Detroit, trashing the city of Detroit. Let's play that.
The whole country is going to be like, you want to know the truth? It'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president. You're going to have a mess on your hands.
The governor, Gretchen Whitmer, says Trump will pay a price for those comments in Michigan, but will he?
I think he will. I think that the people of Detroit and, frankly, the people of Michigan are angry. You don't talk about us that way. You don't stand in our city and talk about our city that way. And he's talking about a city that's very different from the city that we know and that we love. If he spent any time in Detroit, he knows that Detroit has had a tremendous resurgence. Jobs are back in the city. Businesses are back in the city. People are moving back into the city. And the fact that he doesn't know that or doesn't care that says a lot about who he is. But this is who Donald Trump is. I mean, we've heard him over and over again say disparaging things about places where Black people live. It's just what he does. It's part of the bigotry and part of the hate, and people won't stand for it anymore. We're done.
Just 4 words. It'll be like Detroit, Charles.
Really says to me a lot about his mental acuity at this point. There was so much conversation early on when Joe Biden was at the top of the Democratic ticket about where Donald Trump ranked as far as his age in comparison to his opponent at the time. We've heard none of that since Donald Trump has now had to deal with Kamala Harris, obviously a younger opponent. And this is an example of something that I listened to with respect to Donald Trump and his remarks about Detroit, in Detroit, following how he trashed the whole city of the RNC when they were there. And you have to wonder, is this a guy who has demonstrated a level of mental sanity and acuity at a point that he should be in charge of the country for the next 4 years, if at all? And I think that, to me, beyond the bigotry, which I see is very clear and blatant, beyond the attempts to appeal to white supremacy and his base in that way, which is almost always very prevalent when he talks, it was, for me, do you even realize where you are? And that, for me, I question it. I question it significantly in terms of making the connection of why would you go to a city and standing in the middle of that city bash that city, other than to send a message to the people outside of that city about who's there. But also, again, there are myriad ways you could do that without, lambasting the city that you're in. And so for me, it does spark questions about his mental fitness to be in that office.
I'm going to get in trouble because we're out of time. But Lavora, I have to ask you, did you speak to anybody who was actually at the Detroit? No. At the Economic Club?
No, I haven't spoken to anyone who was there. Only those of us who saw it played afterwards. And folks are fired up.
The co-chair for the Harris Walz campaign, Mitch Landrieu, is here. If you've heard any of this, tell me what your thoughts are about how, and I've heard this too from talking to sources in and around the campaign, that where she is in front of voters and any group of voters, she moves them. She moves them in her direction. That is not always, people should understand, that is not always the case when you work in a campaign, when your candidate and her message is the best asset you have. Tell me how that informs the strategic decisions over the next 25 days.
Well, Nicole, thanks. It's good to be with you and my friends Cornell and to the Reverend. Good day to you. Just a couple of things. First of all, I think President Obama's speech last night, as you said, better than anybody else, lays out the stark contrast and the stark choice that the country has. There is a tremendous threat to the country, and then there's a great opportunity. Donald Trump clearly is a tremendous threat, and I think President Obama laid out very, very clearly about why that is. Essentially a 78-year-old billionaire who cares about himself. And if you needed any more evidence of it, not only was he going to let Mike Pence be hung, but just the anger that President Biden spoke to about hurricane relief really struck with me because, as you know, I was Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana and mayor when Katrina hit. And the fact that any leader would try to prey on people's anxiety and weaknesses during their most vulnerable time, pretty much tells you everything you need to know about whether you think that person is ever going to lend a helping hand. He has already decided that the way to win, the way for him to get power, the way to help himself is to divide everybody else in the country. And if there was ever a time for us to come together, and there are many, but one of them is when we're recovering from a storm, because anybody who's been through a storm will tell you that a hurricane does not discriminate. It hits everybody equally. And so I was very heartened by that. Secondly, his communication to the young men. He wasn't just, I know that he was talking in that room to young black men, but some of what he said resonated for white men as well about what being a real man really is, what toxic masculinity will do for us. When a person's policies demean our wives or our partners or our daughters or our mothers or our aunts or even our neighbors who might look differently from him, the entire fabric of community rips apart. And so I agree with you. It shouldn't fall just on African-American men and African-American women. You know, other folks need to step up to the plate as well. Cornell reaches a very good point. And by the way, this vice president, as you know, has been running an incredible campaign. She is everywhere all the time. People first said, oh, you know, she's not getting out enough. Then she's been everywhere to hell across America, and they go, well, she didn't go to exactly the right place. Well, now she needs new policies. Okay, well, look, here's an 82-page policy that goes from soup to nuts about ways you can help me. Oh, well, she ought to do one more thing. One of the things that's happening right now is they keep raising the bar on the vice president. You know what she's doing? She's just jumping over it. So if you want to help, go to KamalaHarris.com and get engaged in what everybody here knows is going to be a battle to the finish, and the future of the country hangs in the balance. Cornell is exactly right. Everybody wants to know, thanks for what you did for me, but what you're going to do for me going forward. How are you going to make my life better? How are you going to reduce my risk? How are you going to lower my burden? How are you going to help me support myself and my family? And of course, the vice president has come out very strongly talking about helping people buy homes with tax credits, building 3 million more homes, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, trying to help those of us in this country, and many young men have this, where they have an older parent and then they have kids that they're trying to take care of with their partners and their spouses, to do that too. All of these things are designed to help lift people up and to pull them together. Donald Trump's whole plan is to rip people apart, because he can only win when the country is divided, and that's when the country loses too.
It's such a layered argument, and I worked on campaigns, and you're right, it comes in fast and furious, do this, do that. I think it was most acute ahead of her debate, where I noticed it on this program, where she had to be tough but nice, she had to be substantive but make a, I mean, I hear you, and I will say that with 25 days to go, everyone wants her to do everything, because I think most of us in this conversation want to continue to live in a democracy. Tell me, at a strategic level, how you really pierce that bubble. Do you have enough time to make clear, because it sounds like the issue with men isn't about winning over every man in America, it's about shrinking the margins. And Sarah Longwell, who's a brilliant pollster, has pointed to this gender gap as well. And I wonder, you know, you had Steve Kerr's great speech, and Steph Curry and Magic Johnson gave a great speech. I mean, the whole idea that anyone raising a boy knows that what you are teaching young boys and girls is what being strong is and isn't. And it isn't being a bully. It isn't standing silently while someone, I mean, the entire Republican Party could fall under that indictment of what strength is and what courage is. And you can't act like Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy in an elementary school without getting expelled. You can't be silent while someone is bullying someone. You can't lie. You can't cheat. You can't steal. You can't live by different rules than the other kids. You can't do any of those things. So where is the coalition that is already enthusiastic and publicly supporting Kamala Harris really driving that message all through the battleground states in the final 25 days?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, President Obama took a big swing at it with a big bat last night, as have many people. But let's keep this clear. This is not a complicated issue for the country. Donald Trump is unfit to be the president. We keep forgetting to remind people about this, but 25 of his cabinet members, people who know him the best, like him the least, and have said to us that he is dangerous for democracy. Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felonies. Donald Trump has been found to have sexually abused somebody civilly. He has, in fact, gone bankrupt 6 times. Now, if Donald Trump showed up to your kid's Little League game, baseball, basketball, soccer, whatever it is that you play, and said he wanted to be the coach of your kid's team, most parents in America would kick his butt off the field. So why in the world would anybody think that those values and the way that he acts are things that ought to be in the president of the United States? That's part number one. Part number two is.
Can I get pause? I mean, he wouldn't pass the vet, because to be an umpire or a coach, you're vetted, and he's a convicted felon. So not even would they not want him, he wouldn't be vetted out.
Correct. But Nicole, the people of America have to face this head on. They know that already. So the question to them is the same one President Obama put that to them. Answer the question, why is it okay for that person to be the leader of the free world, to be the example to not only the country but the world of what America is? And we have to just stand up and reject it. Listen, freedom's not free. Reverend Sharpton, Cornell, John Lewis, when you think about it, all the people over the years that really suffered and sacrificed for the freedoms that we have cannot believe that American people are going to basically bless those things that Donald Trump had, because they're not virtues, they're vices. And that character of that person leads to choices, and those choices lead to consequences that are bad. Now, Kamala Harris, on the other hand, shows up. She goes to some of the best schools in the country. She gets elected as a prosecutor and puts bad guys and other people in jail. She fights cartels. She then fights about businesses. She fights businesses that actually, steal from other people, like Donald Trump's businesses. Then she becomes a United States senator. Then she becomes a vice president, probably one of the most qualified people ever to run. And some people are saying, you know what? I think I like that J.D. Vance kid who's only been in office 600 days. That can only be one thing. And so you have to really kind of just ask people to think about this again, because freedom is not free, friends. You got to show up. You got to go to the polls. We're trying to go where everybody is. Love the fact that Cornell and the Reverend are keeping us honest and say, hey, yeah, but you might be missing this. You might be thinking about that. It's all hands on deck. KamalaHarris.com. We got to go get this thing. I think we're going to win. But let me just tell you something. This is fourth down. We're at the goal. There's not a whole lot of time left. We just got to push it over. And that's where the battle of freedom is won, on the streets. That's the way it's supposed to be. But if Donald Trump has his way, that America will cease to exist.
There's a scene in Jerry Maguire where it gets a little tense, and then Cuba Gooding's character
Show
says,
me the money,
we're just finally getting somewhere. So I appreciate you taking my questions, Mitch. Thank you very much for being here.